before my introduction with a poem that Fred Yamashita wrote, and he's going to recite that now for us, and then I'll give the formal introductions. It's a great way to start the day. Thank you, Fred.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
This is a bit of a spur of the moment that Carolyn Clausen suggested that I might recite a poem that I wrote for my mother and father back in 1984. I was living and working in Los Angeles at the time, and I quit my job and I was kind of bored, so I just thought I'd start writing some things. I'm not a poet. I'm not a scholar. I was a produce clerk in the grocery store. But my parents, they were born here in the United States. My mom was born in San Bernardino, California. Their family had a farm in San Bernardino. My father was born outside of Tacoma, Washington. And he was driving produce trucks from Washington to Los Angeles and delivering produce to the produce houses near Little Tokyo in downtown Los Angeles. And my mom had left the family farm to go to work for an uncle that had a restaurant on San Pedro Street in Little Tokyo. And so it was kind of a truck stop, and my dad would go into the restaurant and became smitten with my mom, and eventually asked permission to court my mom asked permission of her uncle. And so they started that process, but then of course, the war broke out. And so they were 19 and 21 at the time. My father was 21. And I believe, and I'm still not 100% sure how or where my father spent most of his time in the camps, incarceration camps, because they didn't talk about it much. And so I believe that he had permission initially to go into the camps with my mother's family, which was eventually Heart Mountain, of course. Many of you know the history that before the Heart Mountain was completed and ready for occupation, that those that were incarcerated had to sleep in the horse stalls at Santa Anita Racetrack. And then after the camps, it was hard to get a job for many of the people that were incarcerated. My father was a truck driver and was applying for jobs, and I would do reports in high school. I was born in 1957, the second youngest of 6 kids in Detroit, Michigan, and so trying to get information from my parents sometimes was difficult, but they talked about it, and I would do reports in school about it. And so she shared some letters that my father had received from some of the companies that he was applying at by mail. And one of the letters just simply said, "We don't hire Japs." I mean, like, why even bother to send it? But, apparently they wanted to get their point across. And so, he ended up getting a job in Detroit. And that's why, there's so many Japanese people in Midwestern cities, Baltimore, Detroit, Milwaukee, those places where they could find gainful employment. And so as soon as he got there, he sent for my mom. My mom took Continental Trailways to Detroit. They got married and had their family. And so, my name is Fred, right? That's not uncommon. We all know why. It's like, they continually wanted to prove their loyalty, their that they were American. And so, when I started to consider leaving this for them, I started writing, but everything I wrote was very angry. And I was like, I didn't really want to leave that sentiment for my parents, and essentially in honor of my parents. And so being a little frustrated, I thought about it, and I said, why are you angry? Because it didn't happen to you, it happened to them, and they're not angry. And I actually had a great childhood growing up in Detroit. And so I thought to myself, maybe I should try to look at it from their perspective. Try to think how they think and how they feel. And so when I thought that way, it actually came pretty easy, and it's not very long. Like I said, I'm not actually a poet, so and so I wanted to write it, and I wrote it. It's called A Time, and it goes, a time to be or not to be. To reiterate my show of loyalty, my love of life and land is like that of any other man. Then why should we be denied? We can't trust the slanty-eyed. This can't be real, this tale of fiction. Still, I salute the contradiction that waves so bold, red, white, and blue. It stands for freedom and justice for who? A time to see or not to see. What has happened to my family, to my people, so strong, so proud, the tears they shed aren't heard aloud. But anger and confusion seeps through the soul. And what we want America to know is that we will endure despite and within the laws you have forged to fence us in. We will fight for you. Unlock these yellow hands and with our blood prove to be true Americans.
Thank you, Fred, for setting us up for a wonderful meeting today. Good morning. My name is Krista Stoker. I am the marketing manager for the Tucson Desert Art Museum. Thanks for coming today to our Lunch and Learn. Today's topic is Asian American Discrimination Then and Now. This program is in association with our current exhibition called Citizen Enemy, Japanese American Incarceration. We have wonderful presenters today. Retired Professor Min Yanagihashi, sorry. I'm terribly sorry, but and Assistant Professor Brett Esaki, and they will be presenting information on the then and the now. Then after that, we will open up the floor to questions and further discussion. The war years and treatment of Japanese American citizens during that period was a traumatic time in our history. The Tucson Desert Art Museum's motto is to visualize history through art, and we believe that it is always important to look back on history so that we can learn from it. Our exhibition, Citizen Enemy, looks back through art and videos at the incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans into camps during World War II for the simple crime of their ethnicity. In today's world, we have school boards and politicians questioning the books that readers use in their curriculum and actively censoring books that students may choose to read from libraries. Some of those in question include books on Japanese American incarceration during World War II. In the words of Dwight Eisenhower, don't join the book burners. Don't think that you are going to conceal faults by concealing evidence that they never existed. Don't be afraid to go into your library and read every book. Opening our program today will be Min Yanagihashi, said it right that time, followed by Brett Esaki. So I'll leave those comments to them.
Okay, I don't know whether I need to use the mic. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Okay? All right. If you can't, just raise your hand and I'll use the mic. I'm kind of hard of hearing. I'm used to talking loud, so this is no problem for me reaching out to those in the back. Well, tomorrow is the 81st anniversary of the signing of Executive Order 9066. Sometimes it's abbreviated as EO 9066. What I want to cover is the background. You know, I think it's appropriate. For some of you, you're well versed about EO 1966, but for some of you, it might be the first time you're hearing about this, and you don't know much about what happened. So I think it's appropriate, because we're observing the signing of the executive order, that we kind of go back and review the details of what happened. And that really reinforces our understanding. And that just And that's one of the important part of the legacy of the executive order. So, what is the antecedent, the background? Well, basically, you have to look at it with two factors. One would be racism, racial prejudice, plus combined with fear, perceived and actual fear of threat. When you put together these two things, it results in some serious consequences. It may lead to violence, or at least harassment. Well, what happened in the relationship between the Japanese and Americans, between Japan and America? Let's look at first the racial part of it. It's a long history of discrimination that happened when the Japanese came to America, 1870, we can start with 1870s, an increasing number until 1924, when the law caused the cessation of Asian immigrants. So you had this problem of large number of Japanese coming over to the United States. When you have a growing number of any minority, you're going to have a problem with racism. And that's exactly what happened in Hawaii and on the mainland. But there was a distinction there between the two. When the Japanese came to Hawaii, they were invited, they were actually in demand because there was a need for laborers to help with the production of sugar. Well, so the Japanese were welcomed into Hawaii. Whereas on the mainland, when the Japanese entered, they were not welcome because they were felt like competitors in the urban centers and particularly in the rural areas. The Japanese were viewed as competition. And why would we have these foreigners, these strange people speaking a different language, different tradition, and becoming our neighbors? No, we don't want them around. So there was a distinct differences in the reception of the Japanese. But whether you're in Hawaii or on the mainland, you face discrimination. I just wanted to point out it's a degree of differences, but discrimination started very early and increased over the years as more Japanese came. And this is a problem even in today, as minorities come in large numbers. What happened is that Americans become fearful. That's the second factor that I want to talk about. Fear, whether perceived or actual. What happens when a large number of people come in like that is that you have the fear that they'll threaten our life. And particularly, I want to look at how it influences in terms of internationally. Okay, we talked so far about racial prejudice, that's a domestic thing. Internationally, Japan emerged as a threat. Now, why did this happen? Well, Japan won the first Sino-Soviet, the Sino-Chinese War, 1894-95. Japan was victorious, and as a result, they acquired Formosa, which is today we call Taiwan, and also Japan established a colony in Korea. Well, Americans got concerned here, but the event that really turned American attention was the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. Japan shocked the world by defeating this European power, a small Asian country victorious over a major European power, it sent shockwave through the world. American took notice of this. There was a book that appeared written by Homer Lear. Title was The Battle of Ignorance. Lear predicted that the United States and Japan are going to be involved in a war in the Pacific. And guess what? The book came out in 1909. Now that's 22 years before Pearl Harbor. You got this writer, this strategist, predicting a war between the two countries. So the Americans became very aware of Japan as a threat. Fear arose. And what happens is that at that time, and you had rising militarism in Japan, viral nationalism. The government engaged in an expansionist policy. So Americans became very fearful. And progressively, relationship between the two countries deteriorated from the 1920s, 30s into the 40s. Japan wanted to be treated as a major power. You know, it was successful in all these things. But the United States and the European powers treated Japan as a second-tier power. And this happened in Versailles Conference, 1919, the 1922 Washington Naval Conference, and in 1930 in the London Naval Conference. Japan was not respected. That's how the Japanese officials felt. And this caused further deterioration. The military got angry and said the civilian leaders were timid and weak. They gotta take some action. While the military decided they're gonna do it on their own. So in 1931, they invaded, the Japanese Imperial Army invaded Manchuria and took over that country. And in 1937, they invaded China. And that was the beginning of a very long, protracted war. And by 1941, the Japanese entered French Indochina. Now, what was the American response? Well, they moved from the isolationist policy of that time into FDR placed sanctions, economic sanctions, after the Japanese invaded China. And by the time the Japanese got into Indochina, the Americans placed an oil embargo. That was a very critical decision because Japan was totally dependent on oil. Now, the Americans said, we're not going to take away the sanctions unless you give up and move out of Indochina and China itself. Well, the Japanese couldn't do that. They didn't want to give up anything they had won. They decided instead to move southward through the Malay Peninsula into eastern India and secure their access to oil and other strategic materials like rubber and tin. Well, what this decision meant, inevitable conflict between the United States and Japan. So, both sides prepared for war. The Japanese had their war plans, and let's look at what the Americans did. For one thing, the military realized the principal problem they're going to face is a large Japanese population in Hawaii, and particularly in California. So the military planned to remove the Japanese from these strategic military areas. So they had that plan already, back in the 1930s. Then what happened is that as you come into 1940, things intensified. The Navy decided to beef up the fleet in Pearl Harbor, and they transferred ships from San Diego to Pearl Harbor. If you wonder why there were so many battleships lined up in Pearl Harbor, that's the reason why. Preparing for a possible Japanese attack. Generals Short, the commanding general of the army in Hawaii, heard rumors that there might be some Japanese that will engage in sabotage, destroying some U.S. planes. So he ordered the planes to be assembled close together. Unfortunately, that it prevented a nice target for the Japanese pilot in the Pearl Harbor attack. But this is the kind of planning that was already taking place, And another plan was to have a list of those of Japanese ancestry. I'm going to use the word Nikkei. Nikkei means persons of Japanese ancestry. It could be the Japanese immigrant, the first generation, we call it the Japanese Issei. The second generation is a Nisei, which I'm part of. And Brad, are you Sansei?
Yondo.
Okay. Sansei is the third generation, and Brad is fourth generation. Okay. So we use a Japanese term, but Nikkei is the general term for all people of Japanese background, ancestry. Well, they made a list. The FBI and it was called the custodial detention list, sometimes called the ABC list. A stands for immediately dangerous Japanese. B, potentially dangerous Japanese. C, those that have strong sympathy for the Japanese government. So they already had a list of names with priority to be arrested immediately if there's a conflict between the two countries. Okay, another preparation the government undertook was, okay, we got this large number of Japanese in Hawaii, especially in California. What are we going to do? Well, they have several agencies investigating this. There were 4, FBI and the Federal Communication Commission, and then 2 others that are very important. One was the Kenneth Ringgold, who was part of the naval intelligence operation, and we had Munson, who worked for the State Department, but really was an operative of the White House. Both the Ringgold and the Munson report came out with the conclusion that, we got to be careful about some of the Japanese, but the majority of them will not engage in subversive activities, and there is really no need to move them. Get that? No need to move them. Well, so all of these planning were going on. Pearl Harbor happened. Okay. What's the first step? Arrest of those. They got the list. So they arrested these individuals. 2,000 in Hawaii were rounded up. On the mainland, about 2,300. Who were these people? Buddhist and Shinto priests, principals and school teachers of Japanese language schools, and businessmen with close ties to Japan, and then those that work at the consulate. So these were individuals that were on the list. They were immediately rounded up in December and January. Well, what about the rest of the Japanese? People ask me, was I interned? No. My family was interned. Why? There were simply too many of us. We were 1/3 of Hawaii's population at the time. We were the major workforce. If they took us, the economy would collapse, dangerously damaged. And the logistics of it, a mess, moving 154,000 people, I mean, so it's not that they didn't seriously think about it. There was a plan to move us to Molokai, which is an island next to Oahu, which is Honolulu is located. But that wasn't too practical. FDR suggested, well, why don't we move 15,000? But that was also dropped. The reason is the commanding military government, Hawaii was under martial law, and the person in charge was the military governor, General Delos Emmons. He said, well, this is a stupid plan. You're talking about moving all of these people in Hawaii to the mainland, to Molokai. Well, we just, logistically it's impossible, and really, we just can't do it. We don't have the means. So he put a stop to it, and that's why those plans never took place. Well, but they did move 2,000 of those in Hawaii. Well, let me move on to the actual document, EO 9066. If you read it, it doesn't say anything about the Japanese. It simply authorizes the Secretary of War and military authorities to remove, but get this, any or all persons without specifying Japanese, all persons from designated military areas and relocating them in the interior of the country. That's all. That was Executive Order 1966. But it gave green light to the military to start to implement it. And General John DeWitt, the Commanding General of the Western Military Command, started to issue military orders. They were called Public Proclamation, and they were numbered. Public Proclamation number 1 designated the military areas, which turned out to be half of the western part of Washington, Oregon, California, and the bottom half of Arizona. And then you had Public Proclamation number 4, which actually said that the Japanese would have to be removed from this military area number 1 to the interior. So that's what happens. U.S., well, there was about 10 weeks between Pearl Harbor and EO 1966. What happened? Serious deliberation, discussion took place. What should we do about these Japanese Americans in these essays? Well, the military, of course, had their plan. Move them all out. The Justice Department, led by Francis Biddle, and strong arguments made by his aides, James Rowe, and a fellow named Edwin Ennis. They argued for the fact that there's no need to remove them, and besides, it's a violation of the constitutional rights of some of these American citizens. You can't really do that. So they had this serious discussion for 10 weeks. Initially, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, and his assistant, John McCloy, were for keeping the Japanese where they are, not removing them. But they changed their mind because under the pressure of the military. This is the kind of pattern that we see happening over and over again. When you have, on the one hand, protection of individual rights and liberties, and on the other hand, securing national security, oftentimes you're going to have people opting for national security and at the expense of individual rights and liberties. It's happening today It's happened many times, and in the future as well. That's the kind of balance. You can't have a compromise, either one or the other. But in times of stress, mentioned the fear, you're going to have policymaker deciding for national security at the expense of individual rights and liberties. So we can expect this in the future as well. Well, so that was what happened. Now let me, I don't know what time I have. Okay. Let me move on to what I consider when they talking about the implementation of EU 1966. And I want to talk about what I consider the 4 traumatic experiences of the Japanese. The first was forced removal from their homes. Now, you know, the detention list that I previously talked about did not involve families, just single individuals, usually men. And they were usually Issei's, the first generation, although some Issei's were included. But now we're talking about whole families being removed from their homes. And they were given a week's notice, some as short as 48 hours, to get rid of their possessions and be ready to move out. Well, this meant that most Japanese, they lost their possessions. They tried to sell some of those things, but you know, with fire sales, you're not going to get much. Ridiculous price, just about giving it away. They lost their businesses, their property, their homes, their possessions, and all they could do was take what they physically could carry, which basically meant 2 suitcases. So they were forced. That was the first traumatic experience, forced removal from their homes. Now, the government said, we can relieve some of the stress if you volunteer to go. Well, about 7% volunteered, but the vast majority didn't, and they were forced out. The second traumatic experience was the assembly center that they were sent to. Assembly center, there were 16 of them. Well, in Washington, Portland, Oregon, 12 in California, and 2 in Arizona, Mayor and Boston. Mayor was the smallest, only could hold 245, so after 1 month they closed it, and they shifted people over to Boston. Boston was later to be upgraded and became one of the internment centers. Well, the assembly center was temporary, right? So-called temporary facilities. But some Japanese were there for 7 months. Let me take the example of Santa Anita. Now, they used racetrack and fairgrounds because they had large parking areas. You could build barracks there, right? It has some existing infrastructure. So they used like Santa Anita. Okay, they built 580 barracks on the parking lot. Not enough, because they were coming, the Nissan were coming in droves. So they used the horse stable. They try to clean it out, but you can't really get rid of animal smell and of the dung. Horse flies, you can't get rid of those things completely. If you live in a horse stable, you will remember that experience. So, and they were all crowded. You had to line up to eat, you had to line up to go to the lavatory, you had to line up to take a shower, everything, you had to line up. It was just a big mess, okay? So most DKs wanted to get out of the assembly centers. The third traumatic experience, what the government called relocation centers, and the people will call evacuate. Some sounded better, less threatening, imposing, to call these places relocation centers. I used to turn in a book that I wrote about it, I called it internment centers. And most people would call it concentration camps. I have no, reason why not to use concentration camp, because there were people enclosed behind barbed wires with watchtowers and with guards with weapons. Well, there were 10 of these. Okay, so you had 2 in California, Tule Lake, Manzanar, 2 in Arizona, Boston and Gila River, 2 in Arkansas, you had Roa and Jerome, you had Minidoka in Idaho, you had Hot Mountain in Wyoming, you had Topaz in Utah, and you had Granada, better known as Lamachi, in Colorado. You got 10 of these. Well, the biggest one was Tule, but really, that's because a lot of those so-called disloyal people were shipped there. But the biggest I would consider was Boston here in Arizona, with 18,000. It was a mini city. And second I would rank Gila River, with 13,000, and 3,000 were shifted when Jerome closed. So you had in Gila River 16,300. Okay, and the third I would list Manzanar. Of all these, Manzanar probably most of you are more familiar with, and the pictures on the exhibit here. The reason is the photographs, I believe, made Manzanar more well-known. Ansel Adams, the well-known photographer, took a lot of pictures. Dorothea Lang, her pictures are shown here, was hired by the government to take pictures. But the person that I really liked some of his photos was, some of you may never have heard him, Toyomiya Take. He was a Japanese photographer that, they weren't allowed to bring cameras, but he snuck a lens and some parts of camera, and he built his own camera while in camp, and he shaped it like a lunchbox, and so he took pictures of this, some of those, he took over 1,000 pictures, and they found him out, but they let him do it, continue to do it. So I have one of these pictures. They're very potent. It's really small. I kind of downloaded it, but it shows 3 boys behind a barbed wire, and in the background there's a watchtower with a sentry. Now, the agency, the wartime relocation agency, forbade the photographing barbed wires and watchtower and soldiers with weapons. I mean, it didn't look too good. So they said, no, you can't take. But Miyatake took a picture. Dorothea Lang, some of her photos were censored and were put aside and not revealed until after the war because she took some sensitive pictures. I'll pass this on for those later back and won't be able to see it. But that it pretty much shows you the condition of what happened in the camp. Okay, let me say a little thing about the what the camps. The biggest complaint was lack of privacy. It was crowded. And if you assign your family of 4, let's say of 4, and you assign a space of 20 feet by 25 feet, you're not going to have any privacy. You can't get away from each other. And the families were separated in these barracks. They could hold about 4 or 5 families by not partitioned by, they put up bed sheets, but you know, sounds go through bed sheets, no problem. You could hear what other families are talking about, no privacy at all. A big problem also communal lavatory, no partition between toilets, no partition between the showers, just one big room with a lot of shower heads, no privacy. The ladies especially were embarrassed, so many of them went, late at night, late at night. So, besides lack of privacy and crowdedness, the mess hall, it was really crowded. Families couldn't even sit together, and that broke up some family relationship. Okay, now, lack of facilities, medical, and all kinds of just inadequate. Dusty. Some of you are familiar with that place, Gila River, of I-10. Even today, it gets dusty. They have posts on I-10, warning for the drivers to slow down. Well, can you imagine no vegetation because they bulldoze everything, and all the soil is loose. Any kind of wind just picked up dust. So you had it all over. You couldn't escape dust in the barracks. The barracks had no insulation, and only one oil burning stove, and you had to go outside for the lavatory and the shower to another building. So it was totally inadequate. Cold, in the desert, it gets very cold in the evening. Hot in the summer, that's well known. So that's pretty well describe the traumatic experience in the internment or concentration camp. The last traumatic experience was resettlement. After camps closed, and by the way, some of the Eastern did not want to leave the camp. Oh, where do they go? They had no home, no job. Where do they go? They wanted to stay in the camp, but they were forced to go because the camps had to be closed. Resettlement, well, there's some that young people went to school outside the camp, some worked outside, so those that were outside the camp already, the families joined them. You had the servicemen, thousands of them, that were, of course, out of the camp. But you still have a large number. Now, you ask, well, what the government, the WRA policy was to get the assimilated, but when we don't want the Japanese Nikkei to go outside any place in large numbers. No, break them up into smaller groups so that they won't be as visible. So that's what happened in that case. But what most Nikkeis wanted to return to California, back to their old job, back to their property. But they found there were no old job or property gone. Some may have been fortunate to have someone look over what they had, but the vast majorities were not. So most of them went back to California, and they faced two immediate problems. Lack of jobs. Without jobs they could form were very menial, and lack of housing. They couldn't go to certain districts. At that time, they had what is known as COVID contract, where you couldn't confident contract. You couldn't sell a house unless to colored people. You couldn't sell it to persons of color. Of course, in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that to be unconstitutional. And then the Japanese were able to move into some of the neighborhood like Gardena. Wonder why are there so many Japanese Americans in Gardena? Well, it started at that time. Chicago, outside of California, in the pre-war days, you're talking about 400, but with the resettlement, you suddenly got 20,000 in Chicago. That number went also to New York City. So today, when you talk to some of the DKs, you know, one year in Salt Lake City or, you know, Denver, it started with resettlement. That's where they ended up. But it was a traumatic experience. They faced discrimination from the beginning. But okay, let me just end by taking too much time. Let me end with a quote that I use in the book by Milton Eisenhower. He asked this question, you know, how can such a tragedy, and he's talking about the removal and the incarceration of Japanese Americans. How can such a tragedy occur in a democratic society that prides itself in civil liberties, individual liberties, and freedom? How could it? Well, it did. You know, there's a common refrain when any kind of tragedy happens that people say, never again, never again. The word never, however, in some cases gets dropped. And what's left? Again and again. So that's how the situation today is, that hopefully it wouldn't happen, but it could. And that's why democracy is very fragile. And one of the lessons of EO 1966 is that we have to be on the guard, be aware that to informing people that things like forced removal, incarceration can happen again. Oh, you know, conditions have changed. Instead of war, we have terrorism. Other crises will be economic issues, massive turnout, and even pandemic. Even pandemic can cause fear, and the fear is directed against minorities, marginalized population. So it could happen again, and hopefully it will.
So Brett, we can just turn the time to you.
Yeah, you can stand up and stretch and stuff. I gotta remove the microphone over here. So if you need to stand, of course, we've got a little bit. So UA students, some facts I learned from the professor here. First of all, you have a professor drop in science, and he was formerly a non-tenured professor, which should get you to think about some stuff, right? Students, who drops the knowledge? Sometimes people without the T on their name. Yeah. All right. Okay. So that's part one. Part two. As I've been listening, we listen to Fred, listen to Min. At times like this, I really feel like I should learn to sing or chant or something. I feel like there's some kind of like deeper resonance happening going on here. So I don't know. There's something else we need. There's something else you gotta. So I don't know. I hear like music as today's been going on. Once again, I'm Brett Esaki. I'm an assistant professor of practice, which means non-tenured, and non-tenured track professor. And in the Department of East Asian Studies also. That's why I feel like we're like your proteges. Oh, okay. Anyway, so thanks for inviting me today, and thank you all for your patience and empathy when thinking through these difficult topics. So for myself, my own story, all of my grandparents were in the internment camps. They lived in three, Gila, Amachi, and Tule Lake. And one great-grandfather was temporarily held in a high-security prison and on the ABC list. Okay. All right, that is a phone. It's a great ringtone.
Sorry.
Dun, dun, dun.
Not mine.
All right. So when I'm thinking through these issues, I often ponder what my grandparents and great-grandparents were feeling as they emotionally prepared for the camps, as we're talking about, then lived through the dizzying and disorienting harsh seasons of the camps themselves, and then afterwards what they dared to recall in its aftermath. All of them have passed at this point now, but from what they told me, their experience was, and this is kind of the refrain I'm going to think through, not a surprise, but still a shock. All right. So in order for me to explain how this was not a surprise for them, and how the experience can help us today, I first want to draw your attention, a little academic moment, to the concept of course, historical cycles, thinking as a technical historical term. So there were these, just brief academic moment, there were these overzealous French historians, they're overzealous of course, who came up with an important historical concept, and that is, if the same situation occurs and the same results follow, then nothing has changed, and they are in the same historical era. So I'll say it one more time. If the same situation occurs and the same results follow, then nothing has changed. Okay. Even if time has passed, and you know. That is, a historical era works in consistent cycles with repetitions throughout. If, however, on the other hand, you have the same situation and a new result occurs, then the larger historical era has shifted. So that's kind of your academic moment here to think through. For Japanese immigrants arriving to the United States in the final decades of the 1800s and the early decades of the 1900s, they were so-called sojourners. They had already experienced an era in Japan of severe government overhaul and surveillance, with many of the prideful laid low in their home country. In the United States, many hoped to regain some of their lost status, and others felt just fortunate to have a home at all. Facing government targeting was therefore not a new thing for them, but rather was a repetition of their recent memories. But they were entering a new country with a different era of its own, right? Our nation, speaking of the United States, developed anti-Chinese fervor and legislation for decades, and ramped it up against the new coming Japanese Americans. Some examples: immigration restrictions, laws against owning property, and anti-Japanese propaganda came year after year after their coming. So when Pearl Harbor was attacked by surprise, this is what my grandmother told me, Japanese Americans immediately knew that they, as she phrased it, had the face of the enemy. For decades of life in the United States prior, there were policies directed against Japanese Americans, but the policies were largely phrased broadly against Asian immigrants. After Pearl Harbor, the enemy was specific and the act was horrific. My ancestors knew there was not much escape from oppression at that point. So when I think of that time, for me, the iconic image is the one that appears twice in the Citizen Enemy exhibit. It's a sign, "I am an American." It's a very prominent sign, posted on a store top. This was in the run-up to the internment camps and points to the economic effects of public hysteria. For me, this sign means that the shop owners, I'm trying to think of their experience, right, knew that the American public did not believe their statement, "I am an American." Right? It meant that locals, former clients, the people they knew, former clients and customers, looked at this shop and saw the enemy within. Right? I'm trying to think of what it's like to be that shop owner, right? Now, I think, I know my talk's supposed to be about the after the camp ramifications, but these experiences before the war inform how Japanese Americans understood American life running up to the war and after the war. Before and culminating in the camps themselves, Japanese Americans saw this setup happen over and over and knew what kind of cycles of oppression would come. And they were not surprised, shocked of course, but not surprised. For example, and this is where we're going to move forward, not long after the camps in the 1950s, when the United States was at the height of the Red Scare, the government proposed another set of internment camps, except this time for Chinese Americans. At that time, China was rising in power and was unabashed in its calls for, in its rejection of U.S. political ideology. It was absolutely outspoken. And this should sound familiar, right? And the U.S. responded with calls for mass imprisonment. It did not take place, fortunately. For September 11, 2001, the surprise attack on the World Trade Center brought America together against a common enemy. The enemy was concrete and identifiable, and had branches of their descendants right here in the United States. Japanese Americans knew immediately what would happen, and were the first large outside group to protest the mass imprisonment of Muslim Americans. Now, question, have we entered a new era yet? For many Japanese Americans like myself, it seems just like the same cycle and the same era. There were other cycles of pre-war anti-Japanese sentiment that repeated post-war. Pre-war, during the Great Dust Bowl, also depicted here in the museum, some Japanese American farms were already established in California. The anti-Japanese thought at the time was, why should these people be fed and hold monopolies on food production while so many American farmers were starving? Again, presuming that Japanese Americans were not Americans. Hence, pre-war anti-Japanese sentiment held a particular edge in regards to farming and farms. Likewise, in post-war U.S. history, economic downturns have periodically occurred, and the ethnicities of other immigrant farm workers become targets of bigotry. So it's not a perfect parallel, but in recent years, when migrants and refugees from South America were characterized as dangerous caravans, Japanese Americans were reminded of the racist propaganda of the time that depicted them as mindless, homogenous infiltrators of America. Then the migrants and refugees were put into places called migrant holding facilities. For Japanese Americans, this reminded them of how, as Min mentioned, during the war, the camps were euphemistically called relocation centers. With this in memory, many Japanese Americans protested these recent facilities with reference to their own mass imprisonment. So again, I ask you, are we in a new era? In these last few years of the COVID-19 pandemic, I have been shocked but not surprised. With my mask that I wear every day, I bear the face of the enemy. The political threat, the spy, the economic threat, the virus. In fact, the US Surgeon General once called the pandemic, and dare quote, our Pearl Harbor moment. Without irony, or I should say, that's exactly what he meant. According to many American fears, this pandemic was an attack by China on the American economy and way of life. The enemy was specific, and the act was horrific. But I think this is interesting. The face of the enemy is not specifically China, but the masked Asian, symbolizing the identity of the enemy and its infection. I'm always conscious of this reality, the reality that I bear the face of the enemy, walking and driving around Tucson. I know that if I'm not careful, any encounter may turn from casual to caustic. This is the same kind of double consciousness that many severely marginalized people experience on the day-to-day, but this is a time of directed anti-Asian fear. In regards to these pandemic fears, I am shocked but not surprised. Like the experience of World War II for Japanese Americans, today, public hysteria and anti-Asian racism combine into fears of violence and realities of economic loss for Asian Pacific Americans themselves. One way that the public expresses these fears is to concentrate their anxieties onto Asian-run businesses. Like the sign, I am an American. Today, grocery stores, restaurants, domestic services, entertainment establishments, and many more businesses that are owned by Asian Pacific Americans have shut down for both the overall loss of businesses during the pandemic, like everyone, and the specific avoidance of Asian businesses. Add on to this, the threat of violence is on a constant low rumble for Asian Pacific Americans. Images of violence against elders were common at the start of the pandemic, which it shocked us. And speaking in the security of family and community amongst our own selves, we've collectively told all too frequent stories of harassment. This layers onto occasional horrific moments like the recent shootings in California and other anti-Asian attacks that just never seem to stop coming. My Department of East Asian Studies received a threatening phone call on the presumption that we had something to do with the loss of jobs in Arizona. A driver in a white car has hit Asian Americans walking in parking lots. I have gotten the fear face and the stink eye too many times to count. Online and in social media, our youth, who are here today, are frequently encountering racist sentiment. Everywhere from your garden variety, ignorant youth microaggressions like, the slanty-eyed whatever stuff we all do, to professors disrespecting Asian names, to sexual harassment, to visceral threats of violence, and plenty more. The online world is nuts, kids. It is no wonder that we suffer at high rates of depression and anxiety. It just seems like the same era to me. Given this reality I'm revealing to you, one question today to ponder is how much national sympathy exists for Asian Pacific Americans. Yes, overall there is sympathy overload. I mean, I'm exhausted, and sympathy exhaustion, so I take that into consideration. But really, how many Americans see this suffering of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and see it as excessive and not deserving? I am not aware of any studies on this, but my guess is that this very baseline of sympathy is not common. And probably just as often there are those who see our suffering as divine retribution for something. Now, I wish the day-to-day reality of myself and Asian Pacific Americans in general felt different, but I'm just trying to be honest here. On the other hand, and this is the other way, being fully honest with our history is also to understand that this history is not one of pure victimhood. Beyond the fear, there is hope, I have to say. After the war, the redress movement for internment camp losses was the first, and I sadly think the only, large-scale reparations for a racial group. It relied upon community support to build a record of the financial losses that were suffered during the camps, and to host internal debates about what justice for these losses would look like. So Japanese Americans had vigorous debates about that question. Japanese Americans also found Republican support for this democratic movement for civil rights, making it into an intergenerational and cross-political coalition for justice. Now, how often do you see those today? Right? Well, the Japanese American experience is a model for such a movement, and maybe in this respect, our history is a sign of a new era on the rise. Additionally, the research of the ramifications of the camps have been used to argue why we should not target racial groups. For example, court statements and public protests cited the internment camps as reasons to disband the migrant holding facilities that I was mentioning earlier. There are museum exhibits like the one we are talking about today, and public accessible documentaries based on scholarly research and the redress movement findings that have reached substantial numbers of people with general historical knowledge about the camps. A substantial deal for, we're a small group, but a significant moment. Japanese Americans themselves underwent a political transformation after the camps, wanting this never to happen again. They found a common experience across subgroups of Japanese Americans, which led to a grander sense of ethnic unity. Moreover, they found common political causes with other marginalized groups, leading to Japanese American lawyers writing briefs in support of every major civil rights case in front of the Supreme Court, a tradition that has continued to this day. In this way, understanding the history and experience of the Japanese American internment camps is not only for the self-understanding of Japanese Americans, which is important for our own community, but also useful for avoiding oppressive government policies, contesting unjust laws, and for critiquing bigoted propaganda. So, are we perhaps at a crossroads, one in which we can choose to repeat the cycles of oppression or choose to embark on a new era of justice? I think this is an open question worthy of our consideration. We are in a historical moment of heightened anti-Asian sentiment, so we may be called to act almost by necessity to make this decision to survive, rinse, and repeat, or to chart a new way forward. I would like to believe that we can do the latter. In these dark moments, I believe it is not the time to shy away from darker realities, but a time to understand them deeply. Not for claiming victimhood, but to see ourselves in the history of the internment camps and to see our connections to others. Oppression does not make Japanese Americans unique. Rather, it makes us connected. The experience is a window, our experience, is a window through the past and to the future, allowing us to see how the same structures that brought us to mass imprisonment without trial can be used against others. We have a set of experiences of living with threats of violence, and this can connect us to others who experience similar threats. Through these common roots, we can grow webs of support and wells of sympathy, of empathy, is a better word. In this way, we do not need to demand others to extend their sympathy, rather we can ask to grow together. But developing these deep wells requires a practice of self-critique and the goal of remembrance, which is why we're here today. Thank you very much. Oh, I guess we can do a couple paths. We can do open the floor for questions, or we can also just walk. We can walk around. This is kind of a nice community space. We can walk around and talk as well. What seems better? Probably open first.
It's up to you. Does anyone have some questions?
Yeah.
Should we entertain a few questions for?
That sounds
We'll do
good.
that for 10 minutes. Okay. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I heard that Eleanor Roosevelt fought her husband on the internment executive order. Is that true?
Sort.
What did she say?
About Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, how much did she push back?
Okay. Excellent question. You know, Eleanor Roosevelt was very sympathetic for the Japanese Americans. She opposed the removal of the Japanese from the West Coast. In fact, when the internment camps were set up, she requested to visit them, and it was granted. And guess where she went? They took her. They took her to Gila River. Okay? Why Gila River? It was the least imposing camp of the 10 because it only had one watchtower, whereas like Mazara had about 8, right? And also the fence did not have barbed wires. And the roof was a red color, and because, you know, they put double roofing because Gila River can get very hot in the summer. So it was kind of a specially made barrack. So it looked more pleasant. So they took Eleanor Roosevelt to Gila River. And she wrote a very nice article. Some of you may be aware of it. I think it appeared in Saturday Evening Post. But yeah, she was very sympathetic and supportive of Japanese Americans. Her husband, FDR, was he a racist? Well, let me put it this way. He was, suspect of the loyalty of the Japanese. He thought, well, you know, if we get into a war, I don't know about these people. So he was suspicious. And of course, in terms of foreign policy, he was very much against Japanese expansion policies in East Asia. So FDR was more anti-Japanese. Yeah, let me just leave it at that.
Thank you. Yes, sir?
People argue for the justification of the atomic bombs as an alternative to a U.S. invasion of mainland China, which was calculated to have more than 1 million deaths of U.S. soldiers. Do you think that it was still worth dropping the atomic bomb to avoid more casualties by a land invasion, or do you think there should be a different way of getting the Japanese to the negotiating table? The imperial.
I'm sorry. He was asking about the justification of the atomic bombs given the potential American military deaths.
It's a controversial subject that is still largely debated. Yeah, you know, you have two different things: moral leadership and political leadership. I think that many times political leadership fails among many of our policymakers. And, you know, it's a bigger question here. You're thinking about the war effort and, you know, we saved a lot of lives by dropping the bomb versus, you know, killing all these civilians. You know, that's the thing that the policymakers have to constantly kind of balance out. And as I say, it's not a zero-sum, you know, it is a zero-sum game, it's one or the other. But the problem is very controversial, and you know, yeah, and it was seriously debated. It wasn't one that, and today there's more questions than ever before. So,
Just one thing to add. Japanese Americans, speaking from the Japanese American experience, so we were separated by many decades from the Japanese country and political ideologies. But one of the things that was always taught us is, hey, you guys got to be Christians. You want to be Americans? You guys got to be Christians. Because that's what a good American is. And many of us were Christians. By the end of the war, about half of us had been identified as Christians. But what happened? They bombed the Christian city in Japan. Nagasaki was the city where Christians lived. So, I'll just leave you with that question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, I guess I'm concerned. I mean, partly it's the issue about dropping the bomb. I have a personal interest because my dad would have been part of the U.S. Army invasion force. So it's sort of like an enlightened self-interest there for me to say, I'd rather have my dad alive than to be subject to the what's going on there. And it's also the issue of there was the fire bombings and other stuff that was going on in Tokyo. And it's like probably at least 70, 100,000 died there. And it was not atomic. So the issue today usually becomes, the atomic issue. Well, it wasn't like they had not bombed Japan before the atomic bomb. And so it's I think as the professor said, and sorry, professor, it's a complicated issue as opposed to just a black and white issue, because I'm sorry, I'm glad my dad survived.
Well, that's great for you.
Yeah.
That's what we have to. I think the professor phrased it clearly. It's a complex, layered question.
Yeah.
And one of the things about it is we can't redo it.
Yeah.
Right. So. Like speaking for you are alive thanks to you exist.
I exist as I am.
I also exist. I also exist thanks to the internment camps.
Yeah.
My grandparents met there.
My parents met there.
Yeah, your parents met there too. So you're a double. You're double. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have time for one more question. I believe it's a gentleman in the back.
Yeah. In the Roosevelt administration, Dylan S. Meyer was put in charge of the relocation/internment/concentration camps. Later, under the Eisenhower administration, he was put in charge of terminating Native American reservations. What do you think that he learned from his earlier time that he may have applied later?
So there's a lot of complex relationships with the internment experience with Native Americans, as well as the government regulation of the reservation experience. So I'll leave you this one thing to ponder. The primary set of people who are running the internment camps were from the Bureau of Land Management, otherwise known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And they claimed that one of the reasons they decided to take on the job of running the internment camps is they wanted to do it better than they did the reservations.
Well,
And they were hoping that the Japanese believed to be non-Americans would come out of them as better Americans, whereas they believed the reservation system made Native Americans less want to be Americans. So did they learn? Yeah. Oh, they learned, I guess.
Right.
So maybe we do have one more question right here.
Can we keep doing questions so that we all can hear whatever they're talking about?
Okay.
Instead of kind of moving around the room, because I won't hear what they're telling other people. It's up to you. But
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I know there was
Is that what the preference would be in the room?
Sure.
Okay,
Okay.
then let's go ahead, and then what we're going to do is, it's 12:25 now, we'll go until 1:45, 10:02, then I'll make my closing remarks and invite people to go into the museum. Does that sound good? Then we'll go ahead. And ma'am, you had a question.
You mentioned the photographers that were in the camps. 2 years ago, I came to an exhibit here, and it was then and now. This photographer had taken pictures of the people coming out of the camps, and he followed up and showed what they had done as American citizens. Do you know that book?
It's at the dump,
Yeah.
okay?
Do you know which author it was? I can't find it anymore.
Well, the last time that there was an exhibit 6
Uh-huh.
years ago in the museum, I guess the photographer was Kitagiri, and he took the pictures of the internees at that time.
Yes.
And then to today, present
Yes.
day, he took a self-portrait of it. So, yeah, it's, I think that continuity, it's important. When we talk about remembrance, to go back and link it with what it is today, yeah. So,
Is that book available? And do you know that author?
I'm not familiar with the author, yeah.
But you know the photographer, but no, but you just mentioned the photographer.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can
Right.
get her the.
I'll get the information from you.
Thank you.
All right, back there, we have a question about,
With the pandemic and the rise of anti-Asian rhetoric, specifically in our government, with our president, in schools, as well as medical places, do you think that we've entered a new historical era, in your opinion, with our response to the pandemic?
Well, I did my best to do my presentation of how I feel versus what I hope for. Does that make sense? I think with my research and just my own family history, I don't know. I feel like my main job is to give people tools to help think through them, as opposed to being some kind of prophet or prognosticator, and to declare us into a new time. But I think the better way to think through it is, or to state it is, if we want to be in a new era, we have to prove it. Right? We can't just go, oh, it's over. You know, we actually have to. It has to happen. And until that does happen, I feel like I am not gonna not remember that.
Brett, can I ask a question?
Oh,
What does that look like?
So what does it look like when the same setup occurs? Something different happens. So if when I was a young grad student, we had SARS. And I was like, oh man, it was just all this anti-Chinese stuff happened really fast during the SARS epidemic. And so when COVID happened, that's what I told students immediately. I didn't know it was going to be the pandemic, at the start of COVID. And I told them, like, look, I lived through SARS. This is how it starts. We'll clear it out. It'll be clarified. Life will get back to normal, and then it'll die down. That's how I told people then. But obviously it was a much more dramatic setup, which led to much more dramatic issues like Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was dramatic. COVID is dramatic, right? And so if another dramatic thing were to occur, and something different happens, then I'll be very happy to declare the era has begun. Yeah.
Yes, back there.
So kind of building off of this former discussion, what do you think are some of the main ways that if you were to create a different, if there were to be a different outcome in the next cycle, what are some of the best ways to help create that change?
If the results were going to be different, what were the types of things that would have to have changed?
Oh, okay. What would be the results?
Your phrasing was racism plus fear
Yeah.
equals bad stuff. So what of those set up would aid it to having a different outcome?
Okay. The basic factors, variables are somewhat similar, but there are differences with changes in time. you don't necessarily have to have a war in order to have this fear. And as pointed out by Brett, you get other things like the pandemic. And so anything that causes fear, anxiety, will have a response, and it will tend to be an intense response, leading to violence. And the difference is that we're talking about historically the Japanese experience, but today it's linked. It's not the Japanese themselves, but Asians. It's a broad category. So even if you take a specific event, it becomes a wider thing and involves more than Japanese Americans, involve other minorities. Let me just give you an example of how things have broadened out with tremendous consequences. I remember back here in Tucson in the 1980s, I know I can go back that far, 1980s, there was a thing called Japan bashing. Some of you are familiar. What happened is the Japanese experienced economic success, and the American economy was on the downhill. The auto industry was laying off people. So there was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment throughout the United States, even in Tucson. There were 2 Japanese property in Tucson that were vandalized, and at that time I was involved with the Japanese American Society, and in our executive committee we decided to take down our sign in front of our headquarters and put it away because we did not want to have any confrontation with any individuals in Tucson. Okay. So that was the period of the Japan bashing. And what I'm saying is that it's more than just Japanese American, because in that period of Japan bashing, there was a Vincent Chin incident, and some of you are familiar. This is a Chinese American who happened to be in a tavern in Detroit, and he got into an argument with 2 laid off auto workers in Detroit, okay? He got into an argument, the argument spread out into outside of the tavern. And Vincent was clubbed to death with a baseball bat. Now, later on, these 2 individuals, laid off labor workers, auto workers, said they thought he was Japanese American, but he was Chinese American. Well, all Asians look alike. Okay? So basically, you're going to have reactions against all Asians. And what Brett talked about affecting, like the pandemic, it's not Japanese or Chinese, although the presidents called it Chinese or Kung Fu, but it was against all Asians. And this is where we had a tremendous spike in incidents. Yes, so that's what the situations changes, and now it's a much broader thing than just anti-Japanese sentiments.
Well, I just wanted to provide some practical things to consider instead of, one, I would say we need a better, disaster response system, basically, as a society. And in order to have that is very complex. We need to love each other more. We need to have formal, informal, and very practical connections within communities and amongst communities. People did stand up for Japanese Americans who were being shipped off, but they were too far and too few. If we had more, maybe that wouldn't have happened. If our sense of how we as a society deal with fear were better processed, more rational, more carefully thought through about how we feel versus what action we can do to assuage our fears, then we can be better. But it's again very complex because it's not only what an individual can do, but we have to, as a society, become dedicated to becoming a society, to becoming a people where we see each other as you know, our community, whoever they are.
Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I was a participant of the Asian American Pride movement back in the 70s, which was really great, right? We thought we created a better society for Asian Americans in America. And now with the pandemic, it's like, I don't even know what happened, that it's not the way we felt back in the 70s, where people seemed to recognize that Asian Americans were here. And so what I try to push now is the idea that we are Americans, right? And with the experience that, you know, your community, my community as a Filipino American, the Chinese Americans, everybody, do you have thoughts about how our community can finally convince Americans that we are Americans?
Yeah.
What do you like to? Oh, how can we convince Asian Pacific Islanders to convince the country that we are just America?
Yeah. That's an ongoing challenge. That you know, the Commission on the Relocation and Internment of Civilians, this is a government commission, came to the conclusion, one of the conclusions is education, and that Congress should appropriate the money to educate. You know, it's a tremendous challenge. You know, I'm coming from a generation where, you know, there were a lot of misinformation and all so far. But today with social media, I mean, you get instantaneous misinformation and distortion, and it's worldwide. I mean, before you know it, it doesn't take long. So how can we, you know, get this? It's a big problem, and currently, of course, you know, with the news media, there's a lot of effort out there to supporting different kind of conspiracy theory and tremendous amount of misinformation, and it's a challenge. I don't want to get into the more technical aspect of this, but it's going to be a long haul, and I would say that it's still a basic problem of educating, and with what we have on present day with critical race theory, is that this is going to be a big challenge, how to do it.
I'll just add one more thing. I think part of the reason you don't get the response you were hoping for amongst people of my age and younger is a lot of us have been asleep at the wheel. Many of us have bought into the belief that we're fine. You know, and our parents have taught us that too. It's not all of our parents, but many of our parents have said, "Oh, well, you're fine now." You know, and other people have also bought into that. You're fine now. I've gone to a doctor and saw an Asian person. You know, I've been to the bank and saw an Asian person. I went to a restaurant and saw an Asian. You know, like you're fine. You know, you're in college. You're in college with great numbers. We're good. Don't push the other stuff, right? So I think part of it is that many of us have bought into the idea that we're fine, right? And I don't know all the details that went into that. If folks of the '60s gen felt that like, oh yeah, we achieved what we wanted, maybe. I don't think that's true, but that might be part of it. It might just be like, hey, you're going to college, this is what we've hoped for. Let's not talk about the other stuff, right?
Well, thank you very much. I think that one of my thoughts on this last discussion here is the big divide between them and us. We have to learn, and this is all over the world. It can be in Russia, it can be in China, it can be in the United States, Canada, where I'm from. And it's, we are, we're us, and those people are them. And I think that's a big thing if we can get over that hurdle. But as they say, it's a long journey. It's a long journey. So I have some closing remarks, and first of all, I'd like to thank you all for attending this Lunch and Learn. Look at the turnout. I think that this shows that we are interested. We are interested in learning, looking back at history, and also moving forward with better hearts. So I do have some specific thank yous, especially to our presenters, Min and Brett, professors. And I have a shout out to Kenny Importante from the university who brought in 21 students. Yay! And I have a special thank you to our museum curators, neither of whom are here today, but Carolyn Charnley, who put together our first exhibits 6 years ago, and to Alyssa Travis, who presented this wonderful current exhibit called Citizen Enemy. And I'd like to also thank the Southern Arizona Japanese American Coalition and Carolyn Clausen in particular, who was not able to be with us today because she's injured her foot. And so she's in a great deal of pain. Thank you to Louise Entwistle. Louise, where are you? I want you to stand up. So Louise provided us with some memorabilia from her family, and I invite you to go and take a look. There's a wonderful little book of poetry. Yes, so we have poets among us, and I chose one that spoke specifically to me to print out and put on the wall, and it's by a little girl, and it's her thoughts about going home. What's it going to look like? Is she going to be able to go down in Pasadena and look at the Rose Parade? Is she going to be able to go shopping with her girlfriends? And all these people. So it's a longing, and it's a question of what's happening in that. So also on that note, I also want to bring up that Min has a newly published book here, and it's called The Japanese American Experience, Change and Continuity. He has a box of books here if you'd like to purchase any today, that they'll be available. And I guess that's it. So we appreciate your support and look forward to reading comments in the book that we've left out in our exhibit. If you have any questions, we're here. We have some docents here. And actually, you probably know more about it than we do, but we're very happy that you've chosen to come to our museum today. And for those of you, if this is your first visit, please take a look at the rest of our exhibitions. They're lovely. We're known as the best hidden little gem in Tucson. So hopefully we won't hide too much longer. Thank you very much.